Hello and welcome to another episode of the Life After Cardiac Arrest podcast with me, your host, Paul Swindell. Today I'm joined by a regular contributor, Dr Tom Keeble. Morning, Tom, and welcome.
Good morning.
How you doing?
Yeah, good. Can't complain.
I've got you back again. You've been on a couple of times to talk about what you've been doing, but one of the things you helped us with a lot recently was the Not Alone event in Rutland. And just sort of get your feedback on that and the professional's opinion, because you're quite involved with it. And so what are your thoughts about the day?
Yeah, I thought it was a fantastic day. I think it was always going to be very challenging to, if you like, after the Guinness World Record event last year, it was always going to be challenging to sort of better that. But I think that what we did this year was different in that there was a really bespoke sort of educational component, more time for chatting, which I think is what we learned from the year before, but also more open sort of forums where we could exchange views between patients and relatives, normalise feelings, but also between patients, relatives and healthcare professionals who obviously were all there too. And I think we can do even more of that should we wish to go and have another one next year. I think that the ability to talk to one another is just so important, and I think we underestimate that. But I thought it was a really fantastic day. Certainly the healthcare professionals that were all involved really enjoyed themselves, were humbled to meet the patients and survivors and families who have obviously been through challenging ordeals, and to hear some incredible stories and some incredible stories of resilience and being up against it and coming through the other side. So I thought it was a really great day.
That's great to hear. Do you guys, or do you think the faculty learnt from the patients that they met?
I think that in medicine we are constantly learning, and I think the day we suggest that we're not is the day to probably hang your boots up and stop. So I think that, we are constantly learning. I think that less experienced healthcare professionals would probably learn more, because I think that most of the faculty or the medical faculty people you had are experienced people in healthcare who have looked after many survivors and families before. So I don't think a lot of the answers and questions and things that we saw were new to us, because we've obviously spent a lot of time over the last 5-10 years involved with this patient group. But at the same time, we always learn something. And as I say, maybe less experience, whether they're cardiac rehabilitation nurses or OTs or physios, I'm sure learn absolutely huge amounts, because there's so much we can learn from our patient groups.
Mm-hmm. I mean, most of the day was we had sessions that were focused on giving the patients and their families information. But towards the end of the day, we had some breakout sessions, which were essentially for the medical professionals, the feedback sessions. Can you tell me how they went from your point of view?
Yeah, so we had two breakout sessions. One was a survivor sort of hall where colleague Professor Karen Smith from Melbourne and Rosalind Case, a neuropsychologist, went through the challenges that survivors face and the way in which healthcare provides for them or not, as the case may be. And then likewise, I ran a session for the family members of survivors, again, about their experience of being a family member during this difficult time and during the recovery, and what that was like and how that can be made better. And I think it was actually remarkably helpful for the healthcare professionals running it, because again, we got 30 people in the families and sort of 50 to 60 people in the survivors telling us what the challenges are, and then reiterating and then embellishing and sort of really supporting what the needs are. But at the same time, I think it was useful for the relatives and the patients themselves, because they got an opportunity to shape future healthcare for others that would have the same condition. So I think it's immensely useful for both sides of the equation, so to speak, both the healthcare provider and, if you like, the patient who did or didn't have a great experience at the time.
And what do you think will happen with that feedback, or will anything happen with that feedback? Is there somewhere where you can feed it into to improve future care?
Yeah, well, I think certainly from the families that I spoke to and moderated, there was some fantastic practice in certain geographical areas and certain hospitals, and that the excellent practice was the mainstay of that was communication with the family while the survivor was in the hospital. And that communication, when it is good, patients and families find it very, very helpful indeed. And so I think we've got to improve communication. I think we've got to improve education, because that was the second biggest point that people felt they required, was education as to what was going on and what they could do and what they can expect. So I think that has been very helpful, that we must provide more informative information. And thirdly, I think that rehabilitation was a really key feature of good care. So when families and survivors said that they had a good experience and they got what they needed from their hospital and their providers, there was a lot of a lot of cardiac rehabilitation or general rehabilitation involved back in the community. And as you know, this has now led to us going and working with the British Association of Cardiopulmonary Rehabilitation so that we can try and make the follow-up of these patients much better in a sort of standardized fashion, rather than it being brilliant in one geographical area and non-existent in another geographical area. So I think huge amounts came out. I think the other thing was that, as you know, we undertook a survey in a more formal fashion of both the survivors and the families, which enables us to find a needs assessment of what is required. And I think that that's important from a scientific standpoint, to let the scientific community understand better the needs of the patient group and the family group, so that we can shape better healthcare with outcomes in the future.
Yeah, that's great to hear. And I guess we as patients and families, that's our part to play, isn't it? Feeding back to you what we actually want to shape medical practices and protocols in the future. Will there be more of that coming along, do you know?
Yeah, well, I mean, the first thing is first. I think that we need to assimilate all of the information. Our plan is to have a commentary style publication within the resuscitation journal from our group, so that we can say, look, we held this event. We had a huge amount of survivors and families and healthcare professionals come, and these were the outcomes that we have. That's not been done before. That's not been published before. And actually, your group, with nigh on 1,000 survivors and families as well, holds a huge key to unlocking what the problems are in real, heavy data. People will not commission things within the NHS or in any healthcare economy without having data to suggest, number one, there is an unmet need and it's important, and number two, that therapy or that service that you choose to provide has some sort of effectiveness and therefore some sort of cost effectiveness. Because it's all nice to have services, but if they don't do anything for the patient or for the family, then it is a waste of money and energy. And we need to prove to our providers and our commissioners that the work that we are trying to do to give cardiac arrest survivors and their families better follow-up is of use to the families and will provide better outcomes. And that, thus far, there isn't that much data on that, and we need to work as scientists and as researchers and as clinicians with the patient groups to get that data, to get to the end point. It won't just happen because you say it's a good idea and I say it's a good idea.
It totally makes sense. But how long do these things take to sort of go through the machinery of scientists and then, I guess, the commissioning people in the NHS? I mean, are we going to see anything within a couple of years, or is it 5-10 years?
Now, I genuinely think we will see real positive changes, certainly within the next 5 years, but I would hope within the next 2 to 3, if I'm going to be realistic. Because you're right, these things take time to filter through to guidelines, which is really important, and secondly, through to actually then delivering it to the patient. So I think that we've had some very important interactions recently. The two that I would highlight is with all the evidence we've got from your group, we've gone to the Resuscitation Council UK, who we will hold further meetings with, both with your Southern Cardiac Arrest group and with us as a group of healthcare professionals, and also the British Association of Cardiopulmonary Resuscitation Rehabilitation, who perform all of the, or oversee all of the rehab work done within the UK. And I think with a combination of backing from both of those organisations, I genuinely think we have a very, very good chance of bringing about a positive change to what the minimum provision for cardiac arrest survivors and their families is.
Mm-hmm. Well, hopefully we as a triumvirate and maybe even the British Heart Foundation can move things forward, and hopefully at a pace as well, so that less people have a poor experience once they're, because we know people are doing a fantastic job in the early stages of the chain of survival in this country and elsewhere, but it can always be improved. But it seems to be that further bit down the chain that's lacking a little bit, and that's where it needs the improvement.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think as well, your group has highlighted incredibly effectively the complete overlooking of patients with an idiopathic diagnosis, or if you like, a non-heart attack diagnosis for their cardiac arrest. I think those patients who have a heart attack diagnosis have a cardiac arrest as a result. They get a fantastic service 99 times out of 100 from the rehabilitation services that are set up to support them. The problem comes in the third of patients who don't have a heart attack as a cause, who often get absolutely nothing. And I think that is just unacceptable in just any shape or form. I think, again, as you may remember from our talk at the British Association of Rehab, we did 10 days ago, we asked a question to the audience, and there was maybe 200 rehab nurses and staff within the audience, what proportion of idiopathic or non-heart attack cardiac arrests got rehab, and it was less than 50%. And that certainly fits very well with your data from your web poll of 36%, I think. So it's anything between 35 and 50, I would say, of patients who have a non-heart attack cardiac arrest do not get any sort of proper rehabilitation, and that's just unacceptable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it certainly bears out in the group as well, and in my personal story as well, that was the case.
Yeah.
But hopefully things will change, as you say, in the next couple of years, if people, the right players come into the place and we can push the right buttons.
Yeah, and I think what we've got to remember here as well is that a lot of this is not difficult. A lot of this is not expensive. This is just a lot of what I've done before and what I continue to do with survivors and families is just spend an hour talking to them as a human being who has an understanding and an interest in this field, and then really signposting to the local facilities and expertise that there is in the geography to which you live. I really honestly think that is the sort of role of this service. And I think, again, there is some good data from Veronique Millert's group, which is a model that we copied from Holland, where she showed that just having 2 1-hour slots with a rehabilitation nurse or nurse that understands the problems that cardiac arrest survivors and families have makes a difference to them going back to work, having a better quality of life at 6 months, and therefore has all of the also cost effectiveness implications that you might expect of potentially young working people going back to work more quickly. And at the end of the day, most people who have a cardiac arrest and survive just want to get back to the best life that they can get back to following the event, and that works. And that's on 2 times 1 hour sessions, and I think that has to be the evidence-based raw minimum that we provide in this country.
Mm-hmm. That sounds reasonable. And that study was done like 9 years ago, wasn't it?
Exactly right. So it was the protocol was published in 2010, and Veronique will tell you that she had real troubles getting this paper published. It's a seminal paper on rehabilitation of cardiac arrest patients. It's the only randomized controlled trial, and yet it took her, I think, 2.5 years to get it published. So there was a real apathy from the community to want to support and feel that there's a big clinical need here. So I think that's what you've been up against. I really, really do. I think that, if you have apathy at publication level and therefore at guideline level, nothing's ever going to change, because all these things are driven by guidelines and provision. And, if you have trouble getting an excellent randomized controlled trial with a positive outcome published, then, you can see how low down on the priority this piece of work was, which is incredibly sad.
Mm-hmm. And presumably, though, your study and possibly others are backing her findings up now?
Yeah, so I think that, we replicated her work in our pilot care study that we published. But again, scientifically replicating in a real world someone else's data isn't the sort of highest scientific value, I would say, which means it doesn't tend to go into high impact journals. It's more of a real world experience, which, we must not underestimate the importance, but it's not often seen as scientifically cutting edge, which I think is very fair, especially often when there are small numbers involved. And again, I think that's why your group and the survey and all the data that we're collecting provides much bigger data sets and much bigger evidence of the size of this problem.
So we can play an important part. Does it matter that we're sort of not got the scientific rigor that maybe you would have in your as scientists and medical professionals?
Well, I think that this is where I believe a collaboration comes, where we all want the same thing. I want better care for you guys because I see you guys in clinic and I see the struggles you're facing. You guys want better care, but of course you do. That's what you should all strive for. And if we both want that, then as groups we can move forward. I think the key thing is that just one hospital consultant with his group doing it down in Essex isn't that helpful. So, as you know, with a number of collaborators, including Professor Karen Smith from Melbourne, the group in Lund, the group in New York, the group in Pittsburgh, and other Danish centres, we've formed an international task force of cardiac arrest recovery, so that all of the sort of leaders in the world who are doing this work and doing pioneering, piloting services and understanding what benefits and effects we can have upon patients with cardiac arrest and their families, we are pooling our resources, we are pooling our data, and we are going to publish as one group so that we can that's powerful, because it's then multi-continent, multi-country, and allows us to publish truly global experiences of potentially new therapies.
Uh-huh. I mean, the people, it sounds excellent and sounds a fantastic idea to pull your talents together. Who else have you got on there, and what sort of backgrounds are they coming from?
Yeah, so we've been purposefully broad, and to be fair, most of the invitees are experts in follow-up from a variety of different backgrounds. And as you know, there was a meeting in Lund back in May of 2019 where all these experts were in one place for a meeting to discuss the very point, the follow-up of cardiac arrest patients and their families. And so most of those speakers who are doing very, very similar but different things in different healthcare economies were presenting their data. And there was constantly a common theme. And the constant common theme was a lack of education for the patients and families, a lack of good, high-quality communication, and a lack of follow-up, standardized follow-up and outcomes once the patient and family left the hospital. And it was quite scary that people were talking from maybe 7 different countries with 7 different healthcare economies, some funded very well, some funded very badly. And yet the same core themes came out time after time after time. And the same core therapies to try and make it better were all coming to the fore, which was you must have access to rehabilitation, you must have access to a specialist nurse in the first instance, which allows you to understand the problems, and you must then signpost to local services that can make this better. So it was just the same message came out time and time and time again from a whole day of talks from 10 different people across the whole of the globe. And we really then, with Professor Karen Smith from Melbourne, just wanted to bring this group of world experts together under one, if you like, task force, all pushing towards the same thing. Because all of us can work in our own little silos on our own, doing some nice stuff geographically. But that doesn't change anything if we don't pull it together. And so the key thing is to pull it together as a task force to say, look, in these 7 countries with these 7 big centres doing what we're doing, this is what we find. And then that also allows, all of the people we've got, so there's anaesthetists or ITU doctors on it. There are neurologists with an interest in the prognostication and follow-up. There are OTs, there are physiotherapists, there are speech and language therapists, there are cardiologists, there are patients. As you know, Paul and representatives from your group are on the ITCAR panel. So we really hope that we've, by planning, got all of the right people in the right place, rather than doing tokenistic things where ownership is wanted. This is about having the highest quality people in the world who want to be involved in this work, move it all forward in a really sort of community way.
Mm-hmm. It's brilliant to hear. You mentioned ITCAR. Could you just tell me what that acronym stands for, so people see it in the future, they can know what they're talking about?
Yeah, of course. So it stands for the International, because it is international, what's truly international, Task Force. So it's not a guideline body, but it's just a task force which wants to create evidence for best practice. And so it's International Task Force of Cardiac Arrest Recovery. So again, it's trying to fill an international gap, an international knowledge gap that we currently have. We know that, we know all the things about the chain of survival, and it's well documented. The, calling for help, the recognition, the CPR, the defibrillator, the systems in place that you need for a good outcome in the community, the delivery to a hospital that can deal with cardiac arrests and all of the challenges and the intensive care and cardiology and neurology, etc. And then obviously the discharge home. And I think that the chain of survival falls down on the last hoop, because I think, as someone said at the cardiac arrest meeting in Rutland, the first 3 parts of the chain of survival all occur within about the first 25 minutes. And then the rehabilitation basically covers everything from arrival at hospital to the rest of your life, i.e. the next probably 50 years. And so I think it probably needs more clarification that you have sort of a post-arrest in-hospital component, and then there should be a separate chain link which describes, if you like, the post-hospital recuperation, recovery, and getting back to normal life, or as close to normal life as possible.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. Why do you think we're in this situation with sort of playing catch-up on the situation?
I think it's because there's been exponential growth in everything around I genuinely think we are going to see exponential growth in the numbers of cardiac arrest survivors because of all these things in place. So I would hope in time, with all of the initiatives pre-hospital, that our survival rates in the UK will get into double figures, and up into the high teens rather than in single figures and around 8 to 10%, which is the current understanding. So I think that the catch-up is purely that 10 years ago, very few people survived with good outcome a out-of-hospital cardiac arrest. We now know from your group and from our own data that there are many thousands of people walking around following a cardiac arrest, some with good lives, some with more challenging lives. But at the same time, everybody has a life post-cardiac arrest. And I think that we are just playing catch-up to recognise that there's so many of these people around. And number 2, we're really only now just documenting the huge effect it has upon the patient's life and on the family around that patient. And I think it just takes time to create the unmet need, which I think we've now got or starting to measure. And once you've seen the unmet need, you've then of course got to develop systems to deal with that unmet need. And I think that's where we are currently.
Mm-hmm. Oh, thank you for summing that up nicely. You touched on it a couple of times about the beginning of the chain, and you are actually involved at improving that in a couple of areas. And one of them, Professor Bill Toff, was at the event at Not Alone, has helped us in past events as well, and is going to be helping you in the future with something called Heartwise Essex. Could you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that there is clearly no doubt in anyone's mind that the rapid and effective delivery of CPR, recognition of cardiac arrest, defibrillator, and calling for help changes survival dramatically. And not only the survival, but the quality of the survival, i.e. people are less brain injured and are in a neurologically better state for recovery. And the key thing is again, as there's current themes again here, is education. So, we want to develop a complete society of CPR and AED trained people. So there's actually a very nice little Twitter sort of program going around at the moment on Twitter, which says that we want people in VF, if you like, never to die. People should not die of VF, of ventricular fibrillation arrhythmia, because wherever they are, be that in the home, be that in a shopping centre, in an airport, we must recognise that they've gone into it immediately. We must call for help. We must do CPR. And if we're in what some people term a heart-safe town, or a heart-safe village, or a heart-safe, which means that you're within, I think, 500 metres of a defibrillator at any one time, and you know where it is, and you have someone who understands how to utilise it, which can be a problem sometimes. People don't have the confidence to use an AED. Then there is no reason why you should not survive with prompt recognition, prompt CPR, and prompt AED. When we have people in the catheter lab where we're working in a hospital go into VF, and we see them go into VF immediately, we can see it on the screen. Of course, we're in a very privileged position to shock them straight back to normal rhythm, and often we do that within about 25 seconds or even less. We almost never don't get them out of ventricular fibrillation. But we recognise it immediately because we've got them on a monitor, and of course that's much more challenging in the community. But I think the bottom line is that if people collapse in a cardiac arrest state, we need to know it's not a seizure. We need to know not to put them in the recovery position. We need to know to call for help, and we need to know to do CPR and get an AED as quickly as possible to see if that's what's required to make them better. So I think that's what we need to aspire to. What Heartwise Essex does or will do is that we've been funded by SADS UK, a fantastic local charity within Essex, to support training every single year 10 student in all 122 schools in Essex to know what a cardiac arrest is, to recognise it, to do CPR, and to use an AED, so that we want to basically bring about a generation of survivors and people who can give high quality CPR and AED use. Well, you might say, well, what about year 9, year 8, year 11, year 12? Well, Rome wasn't built in a day. We have to start somewhere. But the idea of Heartwise Essex is that we will make the school and the community first responders, it's in association with the medical school and other healthcare providers locally, to make each school self-proficient in their ability to teach their children CPR to a high degree. So that Heartwise Essex is the sort of catalyst, I would say, that allows schools to go from maybe not a lot of training to a fully functioning training group that, with support from us and with support from the medical school and with support from the hospitals locally and expertise locally, can deliver it to all of their pupils in a timely fashion. But we have to start somewhere.
Mm-hmm. And you're basing this on the work of Professor Bill Toff, aren't you? Could you just briefly tell me what he's done? Although I would like to get him on here.
Yes, no, but I'm sure Bill will come on at some point and allow a better explanation. But the bottom line is that Bill understood this concept 4 years ago and said, well, we must train people in our communities in Leicester to perform CPR better, be better trained and more confident to recognise it and deliver it. And so he set up Heartwise in Leicester 4 years ago. And in that time, I believe he's trained just under 50,000 people, predominantly school children in year 10, to do recognise, do CPR, use AEDs. But he's also branched out to running clubs, to other community projects, rugby clubs, football clubs, anywhere where there's a group of individuals who want to learn these skills. And I think there is no excuse for anyone not to. It doesn't matter, it can be a bridge club, it can be any sort of club. It doesn't, again, in my view, have to be a physical exercise type club. It can be anything where anyone is, so that if someone has a cardiac arrest, you have someone with or as many people as possible in an ideal world, with the prerequisite skills of being able to recognise, do CPR, call for help, and use an AED if and where it is.
Mm-hmm. And what you're doing in Essex is targeting the schools. And how does that fit in with the government's mandatory teaching of CPR and AED awareness at schools? Is that from next year, I believe?
It's 2020. So I think the timing is actually incredibly good in terms of fulfilling that. My understanding about the legislative part is that I think it's a little woolly. So I think that what we propose in terms of the Heartwise programme is probably more than is physically required by law, so to speak. I think it will be quite woolly as to how they measure it and what it involves. But I think the aims are clear. The aims are the recognition, the ability to do CPR, the ability to use an AED and do that in a confident manner to save lives.
Mm-hmm. Well, that sounds fantastic. Well, good luck with that. And you've got...
Yeah, well, I think the proof of the pudding, if I'm honest, in time, it's about it's almost like herd immunity with vaccinations. We need to get a county, whether it's Essex, whether it's Leicester, whether it's somewhere else, where there's almost a herd immunity where everybody can do it, so that it doesn't matter where anyone falls down, whether they're at home, which we know are most of them, or in a public place, that everybody has the capability and the knowledge and the skill set and the confidence to deliver CPR and AEDs as required. And then you could imagine we may, and what we would love to see is a spike in survivals, a percentage spike in survivals of cardiac arrest because of that prompt recognition and that prompt treatment. And I think it would be very unusual if we do this training well and deliver it properly for us not to see this, because it would go against every other country that's done this in the past, where they've delivered high quality education to schools and communities, and the CPR and AED rates have gone up, and therefore the survival rates go up as well in proportion to that. So it would be strange for us not to see that, but at the same time, our data collection systems need to be robust and elegant enough to be able to document and tease that out. And I don't know whether that's the case yet. It may just be a bit too broad, but we will see.
I mean, it's a great comparison with the vaccinations, and I hope you can fulfill your aims. And the final part that I wanted to talk to you today about was something that I went along to last week, was the filming of a new CPR awareness video that you were doing. Can you just tell me a little bit about that as well?
Yeah, so I think there's a number of facets with this, and I think that everything, as I would say, has kind of come together in one go for this. So, of course, we're launching Heartwise Essex, a sort of franchise, for want of a better word, but a copycat program of Bill Toff's program in Leicester. We didn't want to reinvent the wheel, so why not just take something that is already working and change it slightly and deliver it, in a similar way in Essex, in a different county. And then, in the summer, I was the consultant at the Cardiac Arrest Centre in Basildon, at the Cardiac Centre. And 1 week, I had 4 cardiac arrest patients come in. One of those patients was Justin Edinburgh, who's an extremely well-known professional footballer. And I think, as many people who are listening will know, sadly succumbed to the injuries or brain injuries he sustained from his cardiac arrest. And he died sort of 5 to 6 days after his original cardiac arrest. The day before that, a very similar aged man, a very fit man like Justin, collapsed while playing cricket at a cricket pitch just north of Colchester. And what was very different to, unfortunately, Justin Edinburgh's cardiac arrest was that this chap who fell down at cricket and had a cardiac arrest, a young boy called Jack, who was a 17-year-old boy, did a CPR course 2 years previously, ran onto the pitch and said, well, hang about, this guy's not just having a fit, he's not just unwell, he's in cardiac arrest, and I know what to do because I've been on a course. And so he immediately put him on his back. He immediately looked for a response. There was no response. There was no breathing. And he immediately did CPR to him while he'd already called for an ambulance and support. He called for the defibrillator from the pavilion, which came out almost immediately. And he shocked the patient back within a very timely fashion to get a pulse back. And by the time the paramedics arrived, he actually had got his pulse back, which is just as we would all want it to be. And it just really drove home the importance that this 17-year-old lad had had training 2 years previously, but had remembered and had the confidence to deliver this life-saving, simple therapy. And so the video that I shot last Saturday, which you kindly came along to, was recreating that day where Jack ran onto the pitch and saved this man's life. And the aim of it, we've done a spoken word piece through a film director friend of mine, Meg Cannon. The aim of this piece is not to teach children CPR. It's not to teach teenagers what to do. It's to say to them, this is a really important thing that you might have to do at some point in your life. It might be tomorrow, it might be in 12 years' time, but you need to have the confidence and the skill to go and do that and just get on with it, and you will save someone's life. And it's just to highlight that is what is achievable with some very, very simple training and a little bit of confidence to back yourself to do it. And it's going to have a hashtag of what Jack did, because I think it's really important that everybody in the community can learn what Jack did, which will save a life and will save hundreds of lives and millions of lives maybe across the whole of the world in time. We need to create a global group of CPR and AED providers.
Absolutely. I mean, it sounds a great initiative, and I've seen a rough cut of some of the footage, and some superb acting in there as well from the patient. and
for those that don't know, I played the patient because the patient understandably didn't want to play himself given the challenges that he had been through. So for the purposes of cinematic beauty, I played the patient.
Well, I'm sure you've seen many a time what the patient actually goes through, so you're probably in a great position to be able to do it. But also, I was just going to say that I've seen or heard some of the spoken word that Meg delivers, and it's incredibly powerful. So I wish you all the luck with it, because I'm sure it's going to be a success. And it's a different take on the sort of CPR video that we haven't seen before. So.
I think so. I think we've got to empower. We've got to empower our young people in a way that they know and they understand. And anyone who's got a teenager out there, like I do, will understand that our teenagers interact with education and with social media and things in a very, very different way to the way that we did when we were teenagers, even though it doesn't seem that long ago. And so we have to appeal to them in a very different way to what we think conventionally might work. And I really hope that this might open a few doors to allow access to teenagers to want to do something good.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And I think that just about wraps it up for this episode. And I'd just like to say thanks very much again for dedicating some of your time to chatting with me. And I hope to speak to you again very soon. Thanks very much, Tom.
That's a pleasure. No, thanks for your time.